To a new code base, orientation can be challenging. You may be looking at a new language where the syntax is completely foreign. The code could be undocumented. The author wrote it to be self-documenting, and why would you need inline commenting? The architectural decisions might seem curious to you. In the case of WordPress, you'd come across getCurrentSite and getSiteByPath. Multi-site functions that read like they would return similar objects, where in fact, one returns data about the current network, and one returns data about the current site. At this point, you would call WordPress crap blog software and throw your laptop out the window. If only you were aware of the project's commitment to backwards compatibility and the constraints that sets on changing an API. In any of these cases, you experience the code base as messy and chaotic. There's a quote about chaos from a philosophical text I read in college that goes, "What we call chaos is just patterns we haven't recognized." Defining chaos as a state of understanding is empowering. It is a perception and not truth. It does not mean that we are dumb. It means right now we are on one end of a spectrum of comprehension. After accepting this, the task at hand is to figure out how to increase our level of comprehension towards the other side of that spectrum. My name is Eric Andrew Lewis. I'm a web developer at the New York Times, and this talk is about tools I've made for tracing patterns in software to get on top of the chaotic complexity that seems inherent in code. I'll be showing some examples, and some I made specifically while working on WordPress Media JavaScript. A few weeks ago, WordPress 4.2 was released, which included native support for the Unicode character encoding. This means post content can now include the Osmania alphabet, which serves as the writing script for the Somali language, musical notation symbols, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and both single hump and double hump camels. While core committer Gary Pendergast was working on this for core, I too was playing around with Unicode. I was reading about AOL Wares one day, remembering a time in my childhood being in a chat room where other users were typing with cool text effects like color fades, waves of punctuation, and what I call party text. I wondered what wares these cool kids were using, but searching for this software on Google in 2015 failed me. So I decided to build some novelty software for this purpose. Enter Cool Text Converter. You get a chunk of text, and it will translate it into one of a few dialects of Leet speak. The latest release, version 0.4, titled Get Happy, came out this last Monday, which dots your text with smiley faces. Other dialects include upside down and backwards text, and a dialect that fans of Lord of the Rings might appreciate. Soon after, I built Unicode HackerBench, which is a low-level counterpart to Cool Text Converter. You have access to every character in Unicode through a paginated interface, starting with ASCII and going on into emoji, mahjong tiles, and combining diacritical marks. Many of the dialects in Cool Text Converter are based on combining diacritical marks to the text you input. We can show how Cool Text Converter is doing this with Unicode HackerBench. We can take the character I and dot it with the acute accent to get the character I accented, which is a common character in languages like Spanish. We can create this is what's called a composed character. We can replicate smiley face text by dotting these diacritical marks on top of each other, which is the nature of combining diacritical marks. Soon after, we get a very blown up character, which may remind you of a novelty Twitter account called Glitcher, which is essentially Unicode combinatory fun. This is a Lithuanian digital artist who created this. With a specialization in Unicode hacking. These tools are only useful in a practical manner if you want to write like an authentic tween from the late 1990s. These are toys, but at the same time, they're educational tools. Similar to the intent of documentation, but in a more playful manner. In most applications, the character encoding is seamless. Users don't see the machinery behind it, nor should they. We're fooling around and repurposing how Unicode can be used and pecking at this underlayer of the encoding methodology. Remixing it in ways that we can't normally as users reestablishes how we understand Unicode. During the WordPress 3.8 release cycle, a fresh push was made to build features for core as plugins before considering them for inclusion. What was called MP6 was the centerpiece of that initiative, the admin user interface refresh that we're so familiar with today. Sean Andrews started working on a feature plugin called Media Grid to replace the media list table with a more interactive visual browsing and editing interface. I said, hey, that's a cool idea, and jumped onto the project. Sean had built a new JavaScript application to do this. Since the look of this interface was strikingly similar to the existing modal experience, I wondered whether it would be possible to reuse the existing code. So I opened up MediaViews.js and started reading, which is a bit of a tome at 6,500 lines. I knew that Media was built with backbone and underscore.js, so I first started picking apart at underscore first, not having a strong background in it. Underscore is a library to fill in some of the functional programming gaps in the current version of JavaScript. Say you have an array of integers and want to extract the even numbers from it, you could use underscore's filter function to boil down the array. It's a utility belt library, hence the library exposing itself in the form of an underscore in the JavaScript namespace. To tease out what was happening here, I started fooling around with the visual representation of the underscore functional library. I took a bunch of underscores functions and expressed their processes visually, which is a refreshing break from the text-driven documentation on the website. I was working on it one afternoon last summer at my friend Nancy's house. Nancy isn't a programmer, but using these visual cues, we described the contents of her purse in JavaScript and figured out the collective worth of everything she had in there. Being human beings, conversation is one of our most basic communicative devices. However, software lends itself towards complexity. It can be hard to keep it all in your head in a conversation. A developer with more understanding may become frustrated or tired of trying to explain the basics of JavaScript to a coworker and the utility of one of underscore's functions. Having visual cues handy for quick references establishes mental models. This lowers the barrier of entry for people to reason about software and become productive participants in a conversation. With underscore manageable in a visual guide, how does Backbone fit into the WordPress media stack? Backbone as a framework has very few overarching opinions about application structure. The main assumption of Backbone is that you have data and you have interface. So in WordPress, you have an attachment that has data associated to it, and that data is represented in the DOM. We call these models and views. We should separate these concerns into separate objects and somehow make them work together. How we make them work together gets very opinionated. These are architectural methodologies for describing the middleman between your models and views. Model view controller, model view view presenter, model view view model. There's going to be some question mark of a connecting layer between them. In recent times, this has been boiled down to the concept of MV star, or model view whatever. There's something in the middle. There's going to be some manner in which you connect your models and your views. So all of these elements exist in WordPress media. In order to understand these parts and what they are, I created a module guide for media. Similar to how CSS style guides describe CSS selectors and best practices. Take Twitter's Bootstrap, where they break out the selectors in the library and give you visual representations of how those fit onto the page. This is also a visual cue library that gives you an immediate mental model of how this might fit into your application or front-end framework. We can do a similar thing with media JavaScript. So I made a plugin that actually sits inside your WordPress admin that goes over the sections of the WordPress JavaScript API that may be relevant to tasks at hand. The typical use case for interacting with media is to have a user select an attachment and then do something productive with that attachment. In WordPress, a user's avatar is linked to their gravatar.com account, which is a service that Automatic provides. Say you wanted to give that control to your users in maybe the user profile page. You could add a button here, and then clicking that button might open the media modal, select it, and then do what you need to shove your data back into your DOM. This can be performed with wp.media, which is a purposefully generic facade layer of the API, because most developers don't want or need to know about the nitty-gritty lower levels. The typical attachment workflow of getting the media modal to show up on your page will be the select frame. Here you'll find verbose documentation on how this object breaks down among the JavaScript properties of it and the corresponding methods. Below is a live example in boilerplate that powers it. So say you have this button on your user profile page to select an avatar, and the user can come in here, upload their avatar, and then set it as their avatar and come back to the profile page. The boilerplate below is overly verbose to expose many of the properties you probably won't need to customize, but good so you don't have to go fishing to figure out how exactly to use it, along with other JavaScript events that you can attach to it. Attachment fields to edit is another common use case for interacting with media. I linked to the codex page here because it's more strictly to the point of what you need to do to interact with it. What attachment fields to edit does is offers you the capability to add more fields to the attachment details pane in the media modal. This can be achieved by simply adding a filter, describing the field that you want to add, and then the JavaScript API on the front end will just automatically render you UI. Of course, on the back end, you'll also have to save that data when the request comes in through Ajax. I grepped the plugins repo recently for instances of wp.media to see what people were using it for. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, given how many plugins there are, about 500 plugins are using wp.media in some way. About 9 out of 10 of the plugins I looked at use this basic wp.media select workflow. Getting lower level than that is possible depending on how you want to integrate with the media modal. But these two integration points of wp.media and attachment fields to edit should cover most of your use cases. Something else I made that's more of a curiosity piece is an inheritance chart of all the objects in WordPress media. You will see that most of these are views and a few models to represent attachments and queries behind the scenes. And I did this just to get an idea of how the inheritance model is working. This was before we had verbose JS doc inside of the JavaScript files to list out these inheritance structures. Further than that, I would suggest taking a look at some of the documentation I worked on with Gregory Cornelius from Automatic about the larger architectural components at play in media. which was intended as a more higher level documentation about this glue in between our models and our views, and what you might call controllers. In the media API, these take the form of frames, states, regions, which describe more the basic structural architecture of how this is all connected. There are many different kinds of tooling that we developers can use and create for ourselves. Don't bang your head against your desk trying to understand why your JavaScript callback isn't firing. Make tools that help you understand how your software works and have fun. Thank you.